Yo, what's up, y'all? We out here, 3 degrees buffer in the house. See my mattress up here in the back. Hey, we making some changes down here. See it in a few days, maybe more than that. We'll see. Anyways, don't want to take too long in this video. Just spent about 2 or 3 hours working on my paper. Not even going to touch on that tonight. I'll get back with you on that another time. But there's a verse I was reading actually this morning that I wanted to take a look at. Stuck with me. Decided to write it down and kind of ponder over it. And in my devotions, I've been reading in Galatians just through little section by section. And I'm in chapter 2 right now. And it's interesting. You know, these little books, Galatians, Ephesians, that's the one I read before this. Actually, no, it wasn't. It was Philippians. I was reading before this. I'll go back and read the other two. But you have Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, right? Those are some heavy hitters, even though they're very short books. They pack a punch. My recommendation, go check them out. You will not be disappointed. But here in chapter 2, the verse that really got my attention was at the end of chapter 2, verse 21, and it says this: I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. Now, I know that you have a whole lot of debates on the place that the law holds in Christianity and religion today. You have some people who say, well, we don't have to keep the law anymore, and that's why we worship on this day, or that's why we don't worry about these things. And contextually, I'm going to go out on a little limb here and say that there's a little bit out of context when it comes to taking it that way. Because when you understand the world that Paul was in at the time, what he had kind of grown up in and come through, this makes a whole lot more sense. Now, just a little bit of background. And this is interesting. I'm laughing because I made a post on Reddit. It must have been a few weeks ago now. And I was talking about how the Pharisees were perceived as being the best of the best. They were the religious leaders, the rulers, and how within their culture, they're the ones who put up the front of being the best, of holding the laws to the best. And they had this perception of being the best of the best. Now, were they actually keeping the laws? No. Were they actually doing right by the things that they had been entrusted with? Namely, the spiritual well-being of the people? No. But they carried themselves as if they were. And this person I was talking to, I actually might make a video on that someday. They could not get that I was saying from their perspective, that's how they viewed themselves. He kept trying to break down and take stuff I was saying out of context to say that I was saying that I believed that the Pharisees were perfect. And it's crazy what people can do. But hey, people do it with the Bible too. Chopped and do whatever. Take your piece and make it say what you want. People do that. It's true. Y'all know this. But anyways, I say that to say Paul was a Pharisee. We know this because the story in the beginning of the book of Acts. He gives you his background there. A young Pharisee by the name of Saul was standing there when Stephen was being stoned. So this was his background. He was there. And he even talks about it throughout the different books, in the different letters that he writes in the New Testament, talking about, I was born on the first day of the 8th month and all this kind of stuff. He gives his claim to fame. He talks about when it came to the law, I was blameless. And that statement right there tells you what the Pharisees thought about themselves. They literally thought that they were blameless in keeping the laws perfectly well. And Jesus breaks that down when he says, y'all look like some whitewashed tombs. You look great on the outside, but on the inside, man, y'all dead. So he breaks it down and it's all there. And you know what? I'm gonna go through that thing. It's gonna be long and it's gonna be annoying, but it'll probably be fun. I hope it'll be fun since I said I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it now. But anyways, context, right? The law was the driving force of the Jewish society right now. When you take it even back further into the Old Testament, you find that through every covenant, and now I am getting into my paper. See, I wasn't trying to do this, but in every covenant that God gave, and especially the Ten Commandments, I'll take that one for example. there's a relational aspect to the Ten Commandments that gets forgotten because of all the thou shalt nots. And this is what Israel ended up focusing on instead of the relational aspect. And when you miss out on the relational aspect of it, you miss out on the missional aspect of it as well. Okay. So there was something that they were supposed to do. They didn't do that because they didn't focus on that element of the covenant. They focused on something else. The law was the driver of everything. Now, because they focused on just doing the right thing or the wrong thing and ultimately struggled with doing that, that's where all the idolatry comes in. You shall not have any gods before me. They certainly did. You had stories of where they were talking about what foreigners did, other Gentile nations were doing about sacrificing children, and how they would never do such things. They would never stoop to such low points. And yet later in the Old Testament, you find that they're doing the exact same thing. They're breaking this commandment, and they're having this dance with the dark side when it comes to idolatry and all these other different practices that they allowed to be brought into their culture, because they weren't embracing the relational aspect and trying to share the culture that God had with them with the other people, right? So it was almost like it was bound to happen. They weren't sharing something out, so they got influenced instead. They weren't influencing out, so they ended up being influenced. But what ends up happening is you go through the Assyrian captivity, right? And this was a result of Israel failing to keep the commandments. You go through the Babylonian captivity, which again was a result of Israel failing on their part of the covenant. And when you come back from that, when you have the rebuilding, Ezra, Nehemiah, we're in that part of it now. You basically have kind of this rebuilding, not only of the wall of Jerusalem and Jerusalem itself, and the temple, but you also have this kind of rebuilding of what it meant to be a Jew. So contextually at this time, you have where the sanctuary becomes highly symbolic, as it already was, even more so. You have where laws begin to be developed around the laws to protect them, so that way you wouldn't get close to breaking them, because we'd seen what resulted from breaking the laws in the past. They didn't want to go through that kind of captivity again. And the irony is that, of course, now you're under the time of Rome, so there's still kind of this outer influence, this foreign influence that's really impacting what you can and can't do. And this was an issue. But the bottom line is, where the Israelites had a turn where they kept straying from the law, now they became hyper-focused on the law. And I think, and a lot of authors will talk about this as well, this is kind of the work of Satan, right? Where he's getting people to ignore it so much on one end, and then on the other end, he gets people so hyper-focused on it that they miss the point. Kind of like when you look in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, depending on what side you're on, and you see where there was a point where the church was trying to restrict access to the Bible, the actual truth, right? And I think that was Satan again trying to keep it from people. But then what do you have on the flip side? After the truth starts getting out, there's this oversaturation, there's all these other translations, and now there's all these questions about which version to trust. I think it's similar, what he's trying to do, what Satan was doing in both instances, right? So there's this hyper focus on the law, so much so that the culture was very sickly, like literally and figuratively. You have a lot of people who are dealing with things like leprosy or other sicknesses, other ailments, and because of the view that the Jewish people had of the law, it was pretty much, well, if there's something wrong with you, then you must have broken a law somewhere. That was kind of the thing for everything. That was the catch-all. If you're not perfect, and if you have some kind of issue whatsoever, it must be because you did something wrong. We hear this echoed over and over again in different narratives in the New Testament, especially throughout the Gospels. Now, Paul, being one of these religious leaders and having this perspective on it, he goes through this change. The story of Paul is absolutely fascinating because of the kind of 180 somebody can do. And on that note, I'll say, you might have thought you've done some stuff, but I mean, this is the guy that had the church almost to extinction in his day with the things he was doing. And on that road to Damascus, it all flipped for him, and he realized, oh shoot, let me change this game up real quick. Thanks, God. So you have him writing now here to the Galatians, and he's trying to get across this point because, again, contextually, it means a lot more to him, the point he's trying to get across, because of his own background and his understanding of that context. So again, the verse says, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. And let's break that down. Very simply, you have a few things going on here. You have this idea of the setting aside of the grace of God. And then you have righteousness that comes through the law. And then you have, if that is true, Christ died in vain. So what we can really take from this is setting aside the grace of God would mean to try to live a life of righteousness coming through the law. It's not saying that you set aside the law and you don't need it anymore, but it's more talking about the perspective and the place that it has, especially in regard to the sacrifice of Christ. Christ came to free people from their sins. You didn't know sin if you didn't know the law. So Christ is freeing you from this bind to like this monolith kind of a thing, in the sense that this is not the thing that gives you salvation. They had it twisted. They were trying to earn their salvation and righteousness by keeping the law, but you can't earn it because we're all sinners, and that's why Jesus died. That's what the grace is for. That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's the grace, right? We don't deserve it. That's the entire point. So if you can get righteousness from the law, that's you trying to earn it. That's the complete opposite of accepting the free gift, the gracious gift of Christ's death on the cross. Those two things are in opposition every single time. You cannot believe in righteousness through working the law and believe that Jesus' death did anything for you. You can't, because those two ideas are complete polar opposites. So what happens? If you end up accepting this idea of righteousness by the law, all the things that I do, then I'm also rejecting God's grace, and by extension, I'm rejecting the sacrifice. You see what I'm saying? And Paul is trying to remind the people here, look, don't let people fool you into this gospel that says, hey, do this like this, do that like that, or these are the rules, that, like this is what you're supposed to do, that's how you do it. No, it's bigger than that. Like, this thing matters, but it isn't the end all be all, right? And how do we know this? Because if you look at the commandments and you look at the people of the Bible, how many people in the Bible do you think broke commandments? Oh yeah, that'd be everybody except Jesus, right? Because he's the only perfect one. And is there anybody in the Bible that God is going to save, or that we believe is saved based on what the Bible says? If the answer is yes, then it tells you it has to be about more than just keeping the law. It's bigger than that. It has its place, but it isn't the end all be all. David, probably my favorite Bible character for a number of reasons. I love his story. I love the book of Psalms, where you get to get a peek inside of his mind. But I also love that he's referred to as a man after God's own heart. But how could God call somebody like David, who committed adultery and murder and broke half of these commandments, a man after his own heart? It isn't in spite of the fact that he broke the commandments, but it's because of something bigger than that. It was relational. The relationship experience that he had with God is what caused God to say that. And because of the relationship that he had, even though David wasn't perfect and broke the law, he always bounced back and he came back to God. That was the key. That was the key. So it wasn't about just never making a mistake. It wasn't about just the law. And it did matter. Like David couldn't live in absolute recklessness because then he wouldn't have been able to receive the forgiveness or come back to God. So they're tied together, but each one has its proper place. So when I think of, looking at this stuff here, chapter 2 starts out with defending the gospel. What is the good news? The good news is that you're free from all of this subjection of trying to measure up to a standard. It's not that. It's accepting Jesus and what he's done for you by grace. We are saved by grace through faith, not of any man, lest we should boast. Like we have those verses. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Paul wrote that too, but he gets it. And you get that little punch from these books right here. Defending the gospel. He talks about no return to the law in that sense of it being the end all be all. The law is not the end all be all. It is a part, but Jesus is the whole. And accepting his sacrifice and looking at life through the lens of that sacrifice and God's grace shown through that sacrifice is how we see where the law plays in. It isn't something we do to earn salvation. It's something that we do in gratitude for the gift that we've already received by grace. It's something that we're doing as an expression of thanks, not something that we're doing because we have nothing and we're trying to earn something. And Paul realized this and he wanted to make sure that people got it too. And I love that verse and I love this book because of how it talks about that. And it reminds us that, hey, just because you make mistakes, like you can't have relationship. Think about it in normal, natural terms, right? You can't have a relationship with a law. You could have a relationship with an officer though, right? And it's a bad analogy because it doesn't really apply, but bear with me and hopefully you'll get the point. But sometimes, let's say in a case where you might know the officer, they might give you the benefit of the doubt, or they might forgive you and let you off with a warning or something like that. You establish, you know what I'm saying? Not a perfect analogy, all right? Like I said, but you get what I'm saying. I hope. Where there's relationship, there can be forgiveness. And the forgiveness oftentimes will outweigh the law and the breaking of it simply for the breaking of it. It's more than that because Jesus is more than all of that. The law is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole. Jesus is the whole and the law fits into that somewhere. So hopefully that made sense. Let me know what you think down below. If you think I'm crazy, let me know too. If not, I appreciate it. But hey, like, subscribe, and share. We talking about more stuff. About to go to sleep somewhat early. It's 10:30. I'm not going to be asleep at 10:30. Never mind. But yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.